Welcome back. Now, next on our agenda this afternoon is our live leaders debate. So be sure to make use of the questions tab in the live discussion part of your screen. You can put your questions to our panelists as soon as they occur. You don't have to wait for a particular part of the debate. Now, the topic for today's discussion can probably be best summed up as how has this extraordinary year changed your outlook? Now, to shed some light on this multifaceted question, I'm joined by a panel of 4 industry luminaries. They are Anne Bentley, Global Board Director at Ryder Levitt Bucknell, Greg Craig, President and CEO of Skanska, Simon Gorski, Managing Director of Lendlease, and Patricia Moore, the UK Managing Director of Turner & Townsend. Now, each of our panelists is probably pretty well known to everyone in the industry, but we aim to leave nobody behind scratching their heads today. So I wonder if each of our panelists could give a brief introduction to themselves and their audience and their organisation, so we all know where you're coming from. And Anne, would you start, please?
Hi, thanks, Lem. Yeah, I'm Anne Bentley. As you said, I'm a Global Board Director of Ryder Levitt Bucknell. We're about a 4,000 strong company that operate pretty much around the world. We provide quantity surveying, cost management, project management, building surveying and other advisory services. That's sort of part of my role, if you like, but another fairly major part of my role is I sit on the Construction Leadership Council advisory group. And under that sort of role, I've been very much involved in the procuring for value and the value toolkit work that's now being undertaken by the Construction Innovation Hub. So I guess I'm here with 2 hats on today.
Thanks, Anne. Gregor, if you could go next.
Thanks, Lem. So as CEO of Skanska in the UK, I look after all of the work that Skanska does in the UK. Skanska obviously is a global organisation. We have about 35,000 people globally. There's about 5,000 of them are actually in the UK. So we cover all sorts of infrastructure projects, building projects. We also do facilities maintenance as well. And from my own perspective, I've got a commercial background, but by the time I joined Skanska, I was in operations. So I joined the building part as an operations director, then moved into civil engineering to do some infrastructure. So I've moved around the industry a little bit, which is one of the fortunate positions for working with a company like Skanska. So thank you, Lem.
Thanks very much, Greg. Simon, if you could go next, please.
Yeah, thanks, Lem. Yeah, Simon Gorski. So I'm the Managing Director of Lendlease's European construction business. Lendlease, does development, investment and funds management as well as construction, and as perhaps we'll talk about later on, a reasonable chunk of the construction business is delivering our integrated projects. We're in the UK and in Italy, particularly in Europe, across in America, in Asia and in Australia, where we're parented. And some of you, will remember the construction part as Bovis Lendlease historically. I've been with the company 16 years now. Had a short sabbatical of 10 years as an army officer, and before that I started out with Langs, pre-Lang O'Rourke for 5 years, a bit like Greg as a trainee QS in my case, up in the northeast.
Thanks, Simon. And last but not least, Patricia.
Hi, Lynn. So I'm Patricia Moore. I'm the Managing Director for Turner & Townsend in the UK. I too began my career as a trainee QS, a wee bit more north than the northeast in Scotland. Still have the accent, obviously, which I'm very proud of, although I've been living in London for 25 years now. I sit on the company's executive board, and we run the business very much as a global partnership. So we operate across our global regions, servicing clients across the world in the primary segments of infrastructure, real estate and advisory. Really professional services, I guess. We don't build and we don't design, but we absolutely specialise in the management of the construction process and all the associated processes that go with it. We're 7,000 people strong across the globe, and about 2,500 of them sit within the UK. So yeah, QS by trade, and happy to be here.
Thanks very much, Patricia. Well, to start the discussion, I think it's fair to say that nobody really expected or planned for a year like the one we've just been through. We're nearly through it anyway. There's a month or so to go. We've all had a lot of tactical stuff to deal with, short-term changes, often reacting in very short order to make sure that our businesses can continue as best they can. But as we approach the end of the year, what do you think will prove to be the long-term strategic changes? And Patricia, perhaps if you could start first. What do you think are going to be the long-term changes and the long-term lessons that we've learned from this year of unparalleled challenge?
I guess, ever since, I think each of the panelists would probably agree that since we entered the industry at the beginning of our professional careers, the industry's been talking about change. I can remember doing my essays at uni talking about how technology was going to transform the industry, and 25 years after that, you're sort of still sitting there thinking, well, what is really going to change? So I think the biggest legacy thing is that the pace of change is now exciting, and whilst it's been quite disconcerting, I think for many of us in many ways, I think everybody is much more receptive to change, and God, we know that the industry needs to change. The biggest challenge I think to our industry is the fragmentation and the fact that we have so many small players. You just have to listen to the Grenfell tapes, to just sort of understand some of the real fundamental challenges that the industry suffers. And so I think, the biggest lasting legacy of this pandemic, I think, will be everybody understanding the absolute fundamental need to change, being more receptive to that change, but also being more multidimensional in the aspects of the change, whether that's the diversity agenda, whether it's the carbon and sustainability agenda, whether it's about technological innovation, whether it's about restructuring of the industry. Actually, it's all of those things. I think that people can now see that there's almost the most difficult thing in change is initiating the change, isn't it? And the pandemic we've been blessed in lots of ways that it's accelerated that impetus. So I think I think it's a really exciting time for our industry actually to start to embrace some of that. And I think that the role of government, whilst government has blown hot and cold over the decades, I think in terms of how it looks at our industry, I think government has really started to look at with the sector deal, starting with that really, and the role now that the Construction Leadership Council plays in partnering with government to take that industry change agenda forward, I think is real differences now than we've seen in our professional lifetimes, I think.
Thank you. Simon, Patricia's covered a lot of ground there, and but from your perspective, do you see reasons for optimism about how the industry might grasp this period of upheaval to change for the better? What's your opinion?
Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, I clearly agree with pretty much everything that Patricia said. I think that the industry, and I mean the whole industry, not just the construction element, not just the building part of it, should be really proud of how we've responded in the pandemic. And to some, you've got to sort of choose my words carefully here, because the phrase "had a good crisis" or "a good pandemic" always feels completely tasteless to so many people who've been so tragically affected. Yeah. But that said, the way that the industry stepped up and responded, from those, from what happened in the end of March, adapted. I think what it did do, and this is probably where Patricia is absolutely right, is it probably gave us a stark realization that when forced to change, when forced to react and respond, by golly, we did. The supply chain did, every part of the organisation did. And it's a bit, and I'm sure later on we'll talk about, for example, sustainability and the challenges of, sort of a carbon economy and how we reduce that. But when you see what we can do, immediately, and how we can react immediately to the challenges, in some cases for business survival reasons rather than purely altruistic ones, I think there is a lot to be optimistic about. And I guess my sort of final point as opening remarks would be, I agree that we've been talking about technology change, and productivity improvement for, again, as long as I've been in the industry as well. But I am starting to see some real traction around that, and perhaps later on, Len, we can talk about the incremental changes, and we could all list off a lot of things that our respective businesses are doing on an incremental basis. And when I made some notes about this, I was going to say moonshot. Obviously, that's become a bit politically toxic right now to say moonshot. But I also think there is, in digital, I think there is the opportunity at last, perhaps, for our industry to transform.
Thanks. Yeah, I think we're all aware that the actual Project Moonshot is costing more than actually going to the moon, isn't it? So,
Yes.
Greg, from your perspective at Skanska, what's your take on, is it a watershed year from your perspective?
It's certainly a year like no other. That's absolutely sure. Yeah, I think it's been a challenging year. I mean, we lost some time on some of our projects, I think, right at the very beginning, and lost time means some additional costs. So I think most companies, certainly in the building sector, incurred some additional costs. We've been very fortunate with the customers that we've got, in that virtually all of our customers have certainly agreed to an appropriate extension of time, which takes away the sort of liability for damages. But actually, some of our customers have also given us some recovery in terms of our costs as well. So that's to be thankful for, and pretty quick agreements with the customers as well. So I think we're quite fortunate with some of the customers that we've got. I think we've actually, I know there's a lot of negative side of this year, but maybe a little bit like Simon, I'm a bit sort of glass half full. There have been some positives as well. Certainly when I talk to colleagues in the industry, the health and safety performance of our industry seems to have taken a fairly big step forwards, which is great. And I don't have any great evidence for it, but discussions with our own operational staff seems to be that focusing on the basics and making sure you get the absolute basics right in terms of how you move people and equipment around the site does seem to have made quite a big difference, and we've probably shed quite a lot of things that we actually just don't need to do. I think it's also been an opportunity to try out some new things. Obviously, we've had a huge number of our people working from home. We've got some very good positive feedback associated with that. So we took the opportunity to bring in a flexible working program for the entire business during this, and we're in the midst of the early stages of that right now. So that's been a good opportunity for us. And the last one, I would say, it's been a lot easier to get meetings with clients. I'm not asking them to travel. I'm not having to travel to them. It's actually really good. It's much more effective. And I've probably had many more customer meetings at ease than you would normally. So that's also been a positive for us.
Thanks, Greg. The health and safety side of things is a very interesting point. We did some research earlier this year with our audience about how the COVID safe working practices have been deployed, and we asked whether that was done in a consultative fashion or whether it was just rolled out from on high. And we got a surprising number of our audience telling us that that had been done in a very, very consultative fashion, and that everybody's voices have been brought together across the industry. So it's very encouraging the way that things have happened. And turning to you, it's probably difficult to come forth in this question, but what were the standout points for you about how this past year of upheaval may have set the construction industry on a better course?
I mean, for the overall construction industry, I do agree that it was the crisis that brought many different groups and individuals together to actually focus on what had to be done. And you know, I guess we've got a lot of years of construction experience around the table, but it certainly was the first time that you saw people, if you like, doing the do rather than just talking about it. And so for me, that is massive. I think the whole digital and sort of, you know, distant working, if you like, I don't think that that's ever going to go fully back. I mean, as Gregor said, we've also introduced an agile working system. We would be staggered if we have that many staff that choose to work from an office full time going forward. If, you know, we won't be forcing people to if they don't want to. But we've actually also seen that even with sort of site visits and things like that, where suddenly people have questioned, do we actually have to go to site, or is there a different way of doing it? And so people have really thought much more practically rather than just using their old ways of working, if you like. I think there are a couple of issues, though, that my experience, if you like, or my observation, is that I do think the industry is actually still quite split. And I don't mean tiers in terms of supply chain tiers, I mean tiers in terms of performance. And I think you've got what I call the tier 1 companies, and they could be very small companies, it's nothing to do with size, who have grasped the challenge of coronavirus and have actually put things in place to deal with it and have improved their companies at the same time. But I do think there are also companies out there that are just waiting for it to finish. And when it's finished, they think they'll go back to working exactly as they were before. So I think that there will be quite a long-term impact of the way that people dealt with coronavirus. And I think that those companies that have dealt with it in a practical, pragmatic, forward-looking way will have made massive improvements to their businesses, whereas I think some businesses will come out of it quite poorly.
So it's a very good point. I think employees on the whole remember how they're treated, and at the new normal you may find your best staff walk if you don't react to their needs in a time of crisis. One of the things that I think you all touched on in some way was about the way that digital technology has really come to the fore. I mean, we are meeting digitally today, and that's perhaps not something we would have contemplated had it not been for the pandemic. I'm interested to know about how companies might have approached their use of technology differently. Greg, perhaps if I could start with you, do you think there's a change in the way that people see the sort of cost-benefit ratio of technology? Have you seen any examples of how technology has particularly helped beyond the sort of, as you say, the obvious ability to talk to clients without them having to travel? Are there other examples that spring to mind about how you're thinking differently about the business benefits, the cost benefits perhaps of technology?
Well, I think the most obvious thing that we've pretty much been forced into is digital communication, and particularly visual digital communication. And I think that is here to stay for sure, because in many places it's more efficient. But I think where it's probably going to play its biggest impact is in the area of collaboration, because this industry benefits hugely when we do choose to collaborate. And the tools that we've all been using for the last 9 months or so are brilliant in terms of helping you to collaborate. They're not perfect for every situation though, and I think part of the skill is understanding when to use it and when not to use it. So when to have a face-to-face, when to have a digital or a meeting. And certainly for those sorts of scenarios where you're traveling quite long distances or even going abroad, we can save phenomenal amounts of time there. And I'm quite aware actually in talking to some of our supply chain that a lot of the SMEs have been investing quite a lot in technology during this crisis. It's great to hear that they've had some facility to be able to do that, but I've had a fair amount of feedback in terms of that. So that's really good as well, because it needs to occur right across the industry to make it really effective. But I would also just make a plea that technology, we need to be very careful with how we use technology. A lot of people think technology is automatically innovation. Actually, technology, in my opinion, is best suited to repetition. If you think of computers and robots and things like that, the things they do really well are the things we get bored with, and that's repetition. And I'd actually like to see a lot more repetition in our industry, because it's actually very cost effective indeed. And we seem to have this urge all the time to create the same thing, but in a totally different way, because my way will be slightly better, obviously. And that's not, funnily enough, true. So I'd like to see a lot more repetition designed in, and hence the DFMA side of the industry suits that perfectly. But the tools for maintaining that repetition, I think, sit within technology. So if anything, maybe it's a little bit of reverse thinking about technology.
Thanks, Greg. If I can come back to you, I mean, I'm interested in this question about whether, as well as perhaps the immediate need to to get on board with digital technology, whether the sort of thinking processes in the industry have changed for good about how we might cost justify and approach the question. Because one argument you might have is that, well, a crisis is no time to spend on technology, whereas the alternative might be that now is definitely the time to spend because you need to create that advantage.
I mean, I think there are a couple of things. I mean, I think that technology, we were already beginning to take on, I don't just mean our business, I mean, the industry was beginning to take technology on board. And so this has accelerated something that was already sort of there. But of course, the cost of technology has fallen massively. I mean, a lot of the platforms that we're using for communication or for exchanging data or whatever, I mean, they're tiny compared to what they were even 2 or 3 years ago, and storage of data and that sort of thing. That, again, the cost has fallen through the floor. And it's really interesting because we see now a demand from our staff all the time for, sort of more and more, if you like, digitally enabled things, and things that I was quite impressed you could do on a laptop. Staff are now going, yeah, but I want to do it on my phone. I want to be out and about. I want access to every single ROB document that's ever been written instantaneously on my phone anywhere in the world, sort of thing. And some of this you have to go, well, why? Is it really worth the investment to do quite that? What do you want to do with it, or do you just think you should? But some of it is absolutely sort of necessary for us to stay relevant. I mean, what we found in the marketplace that certainly we operate in, and it's building on points that others have made, is that a lot of the work that we do is quite, repetitive in truth. And a lot of that had already been digitised to some extent, even before coronavirus, and all coronavirus has done is actually accelerated that. And so for us, it's not a case of weighing up the pros and cons of the business case. It's either you invest in digital and you stay alive, or you don't invest in it, and actually, frankly, you don't have a business anymore. So for us, it's about the pace and the magnitude, not the whether we should or not.
Thanks, Anne. Patricia, what's your view on how perhaps firms may have changed their view about how they cost justify technology investments?
We're probably quite a good example of it. We'd embarked upon a major digital transformation, really, of our core services a number of years ago. And I think the biggest thing for us that we've learned is we were sort of really trying to apply good project management, I guess, to, how you invest in digital upskilling and digital investment. And we've learned the hard way, I guess, that actually it doesn't really work like that, with digital investment. So whilst we had a lot of trepidation about controlling the cost of our digital investment, looking at actually whether it was going to really, return the investment that we had invested in it, and being quite nervous and quite risk averse around all of that. At the same time as we were doing that for our core services, we were also, acquiring businesses that helped us play more effectively in the digital space, particularly around our purchase of AMCL and how that helped us go and move much more into asset management philosophy and digital twin philosophy with clients. And then we were also looking at how do we just upskill our core project managers and cost managers, really, to be able to trade and be conversant in a fully digital project environment. So we've been running all of those as sort of parallel work streams. I guess for us now, the business case has been absolutely compounded for it. And we're a wee bit more relaxed that, we will make mistakes in it, that we've got to do, the sort of minimum viable product, test it, adapt it, and just keep churning that. So I think it's really informed our approach to it. And that's because, it's let us relax a wee bit around it, because, it's eye-watering sums that you have to invest in it, bigger investments than we've made in anything really ever as a business. But I think what it has enabled us to do is think more in a more modern way, really, about how we do make those investments. Absolutely, validate the business case, as I said, for those investments, and accept that we're on this journey of agile development, that fundamentally almost, challenges our traditional project management philosophy, really, as to how you could deliver this stuff and how you get it really effective for your business. So again, it's just it's a function of how things are changing and the pace of change. It's all good.
Well, thanks, Patricia. Between you and Anne, you draw out some interesting contrasts there. As always with technology, there are some areas which are dramatically falling in cost, and some areas of technology which still remain eye-wateringly expensive. Some of those back office systems. Simon, from your perspective, in one of the earlier sessions today, we heard from McKinsey, and they were talking there about perhaps the difference between blue-collar IT systems, which help you to be more efficient and avoid mistakes on site, and the white-collar back office systems, which help you plan and coordinate what you're doing, and seeing perhaps a shift towards that blue-collar area of technology as being transformative in this crisis. Is that a description of the world that you recognise? Does that bear resemblance to what you've seen at Lendlease?
I mean, a little bit. Yeah, I mean, I could certainly split our massive investment, similar to what we've just heard there from Patricia, some massive investments into both areas. So I think about, the way that we've consolidated back of house. So, for example, outsourcing, you could say it's technology backed, but it's a way of taking those things that are repetitive and could be done by others more efficiently than Lendlease employed staff. Our Wipro, we outsource to India a lot of our back of house finance stuff, but only when there's a surety of data protection, platform sophistication and that sort of thing. So that's very much white collar, activity that we're able to, through technology, trust that that's the right thing to do, that we probably couldn't have done 10 years ago and wouldn't have had the confidence to do that. Into, perhaps site operations and activity, I see, I'm sure each of the speakers, the panelists, could talk about a list of examples of technologies that we've invested in, but I'll perhaps just reference one that's very much at the work front. And Greg talked about its repetitive activity in our residential business, which is predominantly our own integrated projects, digital task management, and the use of that to drive the workflow of apartment after apartment, activity after activity, drive productivity and quality improvement. We're all obviously, we're all moved, really sad with what happened at Grenfell, and we know that the consequences of that are still fully to be understood. But driving productivity, a big challenge in the industry, driving quality improvement in the industry, and supporting supply chaining, hitting dates and things like that. That's something that we invested in, with a very small organisation about 2-3 years ago that we're rolling out across our projects. And they're two things to contrast completely, Len, to your point. Major investment in white collar back of house. I could talk about our digital twin, our new Podium platform, where we're partnering with Google in San Francisco on their major redevelopment there, through to on the ground. What does it mean on a particular project? How's life getting a bit easier for our managers in the supply chain to deliver better quality? And I think everything in between. So I think it's a pretty broad church, actually.
Thanks very much, Simon. Time for a question from our audience today, which is asking about the government's levelling up agenda. I think I might broaden that to ask each of you what you would like to see come out of Rishi Sunak's comprehensive spending review tomorrow. Gregor, perhaps if we could start with you, what would you like to hear from the Chancellor tomorrow?
I think what I'd really like to hear is that there is some form of stronger recognition about public sector spending being on a longer term basis. So I'd like to hear that the Chancellor, to some extent, invest in longer term plans within the public sector, because particularly for the infrastructure side of things, it doesn't work with short-term plans, and short-terms for 1 to 2 to 3 years. That they probably need 5 to 10 to 15-year plans to even be starting to be sensible. And of course, it's not without a little bit of selfishness here, because really good long-term plans gives us, as the construction sector, a longer term sight of where the work's coming from, and we can therefore adjust and invest to suit there as well. So the facility to the public sector for longer term planning, I think would be a really good investment in the industry.
Thanks. Patricia, what would you like to see from the Chancellor? And perhaps we can also address this question about the levelling up agenda. What do you think is important there?
Yeah, I mean, we're absolutely behind, the 2070 initiative and reports, and we're a national player, very proud of our regional businesses, and very well, I think, positioned to service that levelling up agenda. We know, don't we, that infrastructure is a massive enabler to regeneration, and also in this situation as a fiscal stimulus. And I think the government seems to be making the right soundings on that. I would say that actually, the public sector bodies that are, effectively the arm's length bodies of the government, whether that's the HE, the EA, even High Speed 2 to a degree, and of course Network Rail, have been really, really strong clients of ours, actually, that have given us a lot of certainty and peace of mind, I guess, through the emerging crisis, whether that was, with the fact that we could see their pipeline, the fact that we did have long-term relationships with them, and also the fact that the government did stimulate them to pay the supply chain, on time or early, actually through the crisis was a really, really helpful thing in the eye of the storm when you just didn't know how bad the crisis was going to be. So I think the government, whether it's in direct infrastructure investment, whether it's through its arm's length bodies, and also whether it's, I think the untapped area really is about us using the government to help us stimulate private sector funding into infrastructure. There's too much of the recovery that needs to be done for it all to come from the public purse and from government. But for government to be the enabler to private sector funding, I think, is the big area that we'd love to see, in that, because if we can just get them to broker some of the risk and unplug some of the investment. We've heard for years and years that there's a sea of investment, ready to make investments in infrastructure, but they just don't like the risk profile, and they just need some help with that. And so the construction risk profile in particular, and so I think it'd be great to see more of the Tideway models, or mutations on that Tideway model, and rather than looking at that as an aberration, look at how can we make that the formulation of a new way forward that brokers private and public sector investment into the industry.
Thanks, Patricia. I think that's a regulated asset base, isn't it, the Tideway, and that's being talked about for nuclear as well. But we are still awaiting the outcome of a consultation that was closed more than a year ago.
That's right, yeah.
Simon, what do you think the government could do both to help the industry and to follow through on its levelling up promises?
Yeah, well, I mean, when I look, I've spent quite a lot of time, obviously from the northeast, but Manchester and across, that northern arc, if you like, which running from sort of Liverpool up to Newcastle. There's no doubt that quality infrastructure is a huge driver behind economic success, and economic success drives improved life chances. If you match that with the brilliant universities and further education establishments that, for example, you see across the north. I mean, I live in the Midlands, Stratford upon Avon, so I'm very concerned about here as well. But if I took the north as an example, and if we could create there, a lot of these programs have been talked about, have been promised before, so there might be some re-promising of existing commitments. But as Greg said, proper follow through on some of these commitments about creating the rail and road infrastructure, not particular sectors for Lendlease as it happens. So this is slightly more altruistic, or perhaps others will be diverted to that and leave us to do what we do. But seeing that happen across the country, so that when you go to Liverpool, or from Manchester to Leeds, or Leeds to Newcastle, or all across there, driving, train, and the like, things like that, that investment in and driving it forwards now, that infrastructure commitment, I think from there everything else follows. I guess my sort of second point, of which could be many, but I'll limit it to two at this time, Lem, is that the symbolic gesturing of the government relocating and dislocating itself from London to the HMRC hubs and other government departments moving out to Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, Bristol and the like, and other organisations following behind where the government has influence, I think is really important. You're going to Liverpool and going to those other cities, I think sets a really good example. And whether the Chancellor is going to talk about that level of detail, I doubt it. But I think continuing to do that with the infrastructure spend that I talked about are two really important things I'd like to continue to see.
Yes, well, they are talking about changes to the Green Book, which is the way that the Treasury determines the return on investment, which may well have that kind of effect, I guess. And what's your view? You're a member of the CLC, I understand, which has been in close cooperation with the government to try and steer a way through this crisis. What do you think the government can do to help going forward?
So I don't think the CLC could claim any credit for what might come out of the spending review, but
no, I guess I was trying to make a slightly different point there. But anyway, yeah, but, go ahead.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think the most important thing that comes out of the spending review is certainty. What we don't want are empty promises or forward promises that actually then lack detail or have got caveats to them or whatever. So the first thing is, whatever it is, we need to be able to rely on it, plan for it, understand it, and actually start rebuilding around it. For me, that's critical. I also think that, that there needs to be a huge element of bravery in it as well. And what I mean by bravery is we've already got a policy framework for social value, for carbon zero, for health and safety, for off-site manufacturing. I mean, I could go on and on and on. There are so many policies that come out of government on all of these things. But actually, very few of them, again, are sort of mandated. So they're nice to have. You can opt out of them. You can explain why you shouldn't do it. And if we are going to use construction, and I use it in the wider sense because I don't think it is just infrastructure. I think there are a lot of smaller building programs that also can have massive regenerative impacts. If we are going to use this as an economic lever for, you know, UK PLC, if you like, then we can't allow opt-outs. We have to do it properly. And for me, my sort of biggest ask would be in terms of how you know, contracts are awarded, how we determine the difference between good and bad, and using particularly social value and environmental impact as real measures of the difference between good and bad, not just price. Price is important, but I have an optimism that says all the right noises are being made. Yes, I think the CLC has been quite influential in terms of broadening the definition of value to take into account more than cost. But I also am now getting every day, social media, the news, everything. Are we entering a new age of austerity? Has the government run out of money? And I can't help feeling that there could be a bit of a crisis of confidence between these two things, where at the very top level we're saying no, value includes social value, it includes environmental value, it includes human value, but actually just get the cheapest thing you can that's built the quickest. And I think for the CLC that is going to be a big challenge to really hold the feet to the fire and say no, all these policies are in place, you absolutely have to enforce them. I mean, at a personal level, I think that one thing I'd really like to see is a massive investment in social housing. I think that we're going to have a social housing crisis over the next 2 or 3 years. And I do think that it's something that you can get to site very quickly. You know, you don't need years of planning. It has an immediate impact. It helps the levelling up agenda. And I think that, again, that's where construction could have a massive multiplier effect. But I have no insight into that, whether or not that's going to come.
I think you're exactly right, and it's the sort of thing that can be done in a much shorter time frame than the likes of HS2. Moving on to a new topic, Greg, you touched on the issue of litigation in one of your earlier answers, and I wonder whether this time of perhaps reflection and an upheaval that we've seen in the industry, do you think we'll get any better at sharing risk through the supply chain, Greg, than we have been before, or any less litigious than we've been before when we look forward?
I hope not. I really fervently hope not. and actually, I don't think it's going to get any worse. But I actually don't think it's too bad at the moment either. What I really hope for is that we actually start to build on some of the things that we've learned during this period, and we build on recognising the strength of relationships. So it's been easier to maintain, sometimes even forge new ones, but to maintain relationships during this period. And it's the relationships that we've got with, particularly with our customers, but also with our supply chain. If you've got really good relationships, then all of the areas that you've got a potential disagreement or a dispute on, you can work them out. And the last thing with all due respect to the lawyers of this world, the last thing we want to be doing is spending a load of money with lawyers. And quite often we're never quite satisfied with the result. We've all been there at some point in our career. You're never quite satisfied with the result, and you look back and you actually know that probably 2/3 of the way through the process, absolute max, you should have just sat down and said, hang on a second, let's just try and sort this out. So maybe that's just sort of going into a little bit of common sense speak, but it's going to do the industry no good, particularly if it starts to get itself into, you know, some difficult places. I mean, Anne was sort of alluding to the fact that the next couple of years could be tricky if it's allowed to be tricky and the investment doesn't continue there. If that does happen, the last thing we want to do is to end up with more and more disputes. If anything, we need to collaborate even more. And if there's less investment, well, let's work out how to make it go further and be smarter. And I'd have to say fair across the industry. We need to make sure that the SMEs get their fair share of investment money as well.
Thanks. Patricia, I think in one of your earlier answers you touched on the Grenfell inquiry and how that has sort of really opened up, well, perhaps it's like lifting a rock and seeing all of the creepy crawlies underneath it. I don't know whether you think that this year, the change of mindset that's happened this year, combined with that Grenfell inquiry going on at the same time, will force a change in the way that the industry works around risk and these kinds of questions. What do you think? I
mean, I think we've seen, you know, where the industry's gone to. Many people are saying our industry's broken, you know, and that really is the result of years and years of, you know, driving down fees, driving down margins, you know, that leads to almost the lowest common denominator for delivery. And I think, you know, Grenfell has acted as a great shock really about what happens whenever you buy cheap and you don't really look at the consequences of, you know, what you're specifying, and everybody passes the buck and no one's really accountable and responsible. And, you know, our industry, you know, has as we know, come through, you know, different phases, I guess, of where, you know, we go from being, you know, in the doldrums to being, you know, having Captain Underpants to being back in the doldrums again, you know, and we seem to go through these cycles. You know, we know that things have got to change. I think, again, the number of industry initiatives to drive that change, I think, is you know, is greater than it's ever been, you know. And I remember, you know, back from Latham, and the big thing I think that drives the change, that makes the change stick, is whenever the government interjects. And, you know, the government drove the change, you know, with the Housing Grants Construction Regeneration Act. The government drove the change by mandating the use of the NEC. The government mandates, and, you know, is still the industry's biggest single number one client. And when the government mandates, then we get industry change. And I think that, you know, that's what's exciting, I think, about the construction playbook. You know, the IPA route map's been reauthored, you know, to take account of the playbook, so that we have, and, you know, Project 13 was another great initiative, I think, you know, by the industry itself, to really look at how can we change the models and change the risk allocation through the supply chain and through the industry arrangement, really. So, you know, there's lots and lots of different formulations, I think, for the catalyst of change. And what we've got to do is absolutely make sure that we bring that back. And I think Anne's point was a great point, really, about how, you know, government using its weight to, you know, in things like tomorrow's spending review, to mandate and make that change sticky. will be fundamental to it. We can no longer have supply chain organisations that are effectively making 1.5% margin and expect them to be high performing. It doesn't correlate. And so, I think that's what I think is the big opportunity, that we start to take and implement now some of the good thinking that has been developing over the past 5 years about how we really drive lasting change in the industry. And I think risk allocation is fundamental to that. Actually, this is a great question, Lynn.
Yes, thank you. We're nearing the end of the session. I want to move on to a new topic. Simon, you touched in your introduction, and I think about the importance of sustainability. We've also had a question here about how organisations can drive diversity in their organisations. I want to link those two together and ask, well, can organisations keep focus on some of these long-term issues which are perhaps not front and center in their sort of tactical thinking at a time of big upheaval? How do we make sure that we don't forget things like diversity, the need to turn around our approach to net zero, the need to carry on training people, etc.?
Well, I probably speak for all the panelists that at every board meeting, every management meeting that I have, the two areas that you've described do not sit as A or B. They sit as front and centre. We've just launched in August our new sort of sustainability targets, and they'll be very similar to others. And right now we're all working on detailed route maps and pathways to scope 1 and 2, 3. How we're getting to net carbon zero for scope 1 and 2, the sites that we run, the offices that we manage, and then how do we get there with product, with concrete, with steel. And that requires, it's a really important point that Patricia talks about supply chain making profit, enough to invest in R&D, because we're only going to get there if people have the confidence in the long-term pipeline that Greg talked about, and then making appropriate margins that Patricia talked about, so they can invest in technology improvements in, for example, concrete, steel and the like. So certainly from an organisational point of view around, and that's environmental sustainability, social sustainability, social value. Again, we've made huge commitments, and I'm sure the other panelists' organisations have done exactly the same. And I'm delighted to see that clients, not Section 106 agreement requirements, I think that's a bit passé, that's just what is mandated, but I think organisations like all of ours making commitments that recognise we all have a part to play in society, that we have a role to play. And I'm not saying this is a sales pitch, I'm just saying this is a matter of who we each are as our organisations and our industry. I guess my final point, conscious of time, is that while 2020 is the year of the pandemic, it's also the year of George Floyd and Black Lives Matters. And I think that, I've been delighted with the progress. That I shouldn't be excited by, it should be just business as usual, the way that we've, from a diversity around gender at a leadership level within our organisation, pretty much half of my executive team is made up by, high calibre, female professionals. But when I look in the mirror at the diversity at a leadership level from those that come from a BAME background, it's nowhere near good enough. It's nowhere near good enough. And we're not attracting people, at the lowest levels into the industry, new entrants into the industry. And, people like myself have to look very hard in the mirror and say, am I doing a good enough job at the moment? And I'm not.
Thank you, Simon. I'm sure you're absolutely right about all of the participants in today's panel could tell a similar story. But I think, Anne, perhaps I might turn to you for the last word. How would you address that question about how the industry can stay focused on all of the things which aren't right in front of them, that are perhaps these issues about long-term transformation in what they do?
So I think that a lot of this will actually come from client pressure, particularly, or I hope it'll come from client pressure. Clearly, all of us will have our own visions, our own business values, the things that we believe we should implement simply because they're the businesses we own or work in or whatever. But I do think that clients, and particularly public sector clients, have really woken up to the fact that the investment should have a multiplier effect. It shouldn't just be I'm investing £1 billion and I get £1 billion back. It's I'm investing £1 billion and it has a multiplier effect in terms of social value, in terms of reducing environmental impact, in terms of equality, in terms of social cohesion, etc. And for me, the most exciting exciting thing that I'm working on at the moment. I said in my introduction, I'm working with Construction Innovation Hub on a thing called the Value Toolkit. And what the Value Toolkit does is actually gives clients a way of calibrating this. So actually say, what is it I'm trying to achieve? How do I measure what I'm trying to achieve? How do I then engage with companies, whether they're consultants, contractors, supply chain, FM companies, that actually share my values, that are likely to, or more likely than not at least, to deliver the product that I want in the format that I wanted. And I'm not now talking about, deliver a school. I'm talking about a school that's got community cohesion, that's net carbon zero, that raises the educational performance of the kids, and suddenly changing the vocabulary of clients to this, the outcomes that they're trying to deliver, but then giving them a methodology to calibrate that and measure it and say, actually, are you likely to achieve it? I think will be game changing for the industry. But this is where I come back to the need for bravery, because if clients, particularly public sector clients, go, oh yeah, but it's a bit difficult and I'll just tender on a spec that I've already got for the lowest price, it'll all fall away. I don't think that that's where the sentiment is at the moment. I am very optimistic, but we're all going to have to work really hard and keep the feet to the fire, as I said, to make sure that it doesn't start falling away very quickly.
Well, thanks, Anne. Yes, I think we've all worked really hard in 2020, but as you say, bravery and more hard work ahead in 2021. I'm afraid that's where we must leave it now. So thanks very much to all of our panelists, to Anne, Patricia, to Simon and Gregor for their contributions to a fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.